Well, we are now going to hear from Maggie. Maggie, as I say, is former Vice Chair of the British Association of Social Workers. She's vast experience of working with families. She's been part of the brains of our operation, and like Stuart, for example, whenever we put out anything by her on social media, we always get fan mail. So, Maggie, it's great to have you with us today. Please come and speak to us.
Hi, good morning. I'm just going to get myself some water here. Thank you very much to the campaign for inviting me to speak. And I want to let you know, first of all, that the panel today is not representative of the usual panel. And I want to recognise the work of Leslie Scott of the Times Trust and Alison Pruce of various persuasions, and Jennifer Cunningham, paediatrician, who are my usual fellows on these speaking things and who've done really fantastic work in the campaign. You'll hear from them later. So the question was, is named person, is it doomed or is it just delayed? Well, my view, I think the Supreme Court has spoken, and that was very good. It was an excellent judgment and it was a victory. The law as it stood was no more. But the law is one thing, and culture and practice on the ground is quite another. The Supreme Court ruled on the basis of the legality of the named person and its parent policy of getting it right for every child. The government and the supporters of the named person have made much of the court's ruling that the intention was legitimate, as Stuart pointed to. But everyone knows, as my mother used to say, and I'm sure lots of us do, the road to hell is often paved with good and legitimate intentions. Now, we're certainly not in hell in Scotland. I think Scotland's a fantastic country. Most of the children in Scotland are healthy and happy. The biggest threat to children's welfare or well-being is poverty and inequality. We found out 1/3 of the children in Scotland are now living in poverty. That's the biggest threat. So I welcome the Scottish Government's anti-poverty bill. I'm not an opponent of government in absolutely everything, and I do think government has a huge role to play in improving the welfare of the country's children. But most children, whether they're in poverty or not, are loved and cherished and protected by their parents. The problem we have with the Named Person project, it didn't appear from nowhere. It was a confirmation, as Stuart said, that the state had claimed or was claiming family life as part of its legitimate domain to regulate and prescribe how children should be brought up. And that's now become embedded as a government right and role. It doesn't matter if that is regulating from the left or from the right or from any other political perspective. It's just wrong. Families, like love and care and affection, were not invented by governments, and they don't belong to governments. Families are a good thing, and they are not hotbeds of risk and harm. Children being harmed in their families isn't the norm, but it's the exception that proves the rule, that families are good, safe places. That rule is that families are the safest and best way that we know that the human race has come up with to bring children up in. It's shocking and upsetting when a child is killed by a parent, and that's because it's not usual, not because it's usual. But unfortunately, that's not the understanding that lies behind the named person legislation. That is based on an understanding that families are dangerous, but that named persons are not. We were told that families asked for the named person law. They didn't. What parents of children with disabilities, this is our special needs, this is what actually the government's talking about. What they asked for was a single point of contact within the services that they had to deal with. These services throw them from one to the other. They don't take responsibility for the child's needs. They cost shunting, counting incontinence pads, refusing a £10 toilet seat or a home help or respite care for the parents, and then being prepared to spend £200,000 a year on a residential placement if the parents crack up. That's what those parents were complaining about, and they wanted a point of contact to make services accountable to them. But what was created in the named person wasn't a point of contact for parents, it was a point of contact about parents. The Act made parents and families accountable to services. It didn't in any way make services accountable to parents. We've now got to get it right for services. We've got to get it right for the named person. Now, social workers, and I have been a social worker for a long time, I work independently now, social workers used to be welcomed by families if they had difficulties. And that's not to say that they always got a good service. They didn't. But now, no one wants a social worker at their door, and that's because there's increasing pressure for every case to be seen as a child protection case. Every family that comes to social work for help is assessed on whether they present a child protection issue or not. And that's made social workers and social work with children and families deeply unpopular, which is a huge problem. Now, the first line child protection test is the so-called Shinari test. That's under the GIRFIT, Getting It Right for Every Child, the indicators of well-being and risk. And not one of which is poverty, by the way. When they look at all the risks to a child, not one is poverty. There's nothing about homelessness. I think there's maybe one risk indicator, but it's not about any of the things that we know are a real risk to children and actually currently affecting so many children. And there's not a risk indicator for being maltreated or interfered with or neglected by services. That's not something, they're not going to inspect themselves for how well they're doing by the parent. So the Children and Young People Act and the named person provision indicated that every family in the country was judged to be in need of a risk assessment by a service provider. When the project was challenged by the campaign, the government couldn't actually explain why this measure, which they had assured us was voluntary and what parents wanted, was in fact compulsory, and that 99% or more of parents knew nothing about it. When the government had to acknowledge that it was compulsory, they changed their story about its benign universal intentions and then said that compulsory named persons were essential to prevent children being killed at the hands of their parents, and that we as a campaign would be responsible for child deaths for adopting such an appallingly anti-child perspective. But what else did this mean except that all parents are suspects and the individual surveillance of every family is the means of enforcing child safety? So I believe that the Named Person Project has caused harm and that the Supreme Court ruling alone will not stop it creating more harm. It's further entrenched lack of trust between parents and professionals. It has made professionals afraid for themselves across the whole of the public sector. Now, it's not just social workers who are in the firing line if anything goes wrong. And that's a scary place to be. Social workers have been pilloried, they're driven to suicide, their houses, down at the Caleb Ness case in London. So it's a terrifying place to be. But now we have spread that alarm across the whole of the named person, everybody who's in it. The named person's in the frame. And all those people know it. And I believe that what happens is that they begin to see families as a risk, as an enemy. This is something that's all too evident in child protection social work. That's how that has developed, where every family is seen almost as the enemy and somebody that might ruin your life. What has been achieved has also the creation of a new and lower threshold for interfering in family life. It's not significant harm, it's anything that might affect a child's well-being in the opinion of any person who's employed in services practically. The interference in family life of being watched and judged, even if you're judged innocent, even after you might get a clean bill of health, some say, you're the best mum and dad in the world. But actually that interference has been a harm in itself to parents and to children. We've downgraded parents and we've made their judgment subject to second guessing and contradiction by any one of a number of named persons that they and their children will encounter in their childhood. And power, I think, makes bullies of us all. It offers lack of accountability, the right to dictate to others, the right to define the meaning and the purpose of other people's lives. If this was a brilliant way of going about things, if this was the best way to bring up children, then we might just have to suck it up as parents and accept that all sorts of people are better than we are at bringing up our children. But in fact, as governments should know by now, the state makes a lousy parent. There are currently official inquiries going on in every jurisdiction of the UK into the historic abuse of children in any and every non-family setting: school, children's homes, secure units, prisons. Every government has enormous trouble in holding itself to account. These inquiries are mired in trouble. It's much easier to hold parents to account and to blame parents for all of the social problems that exist and tell us to pull our socks up. So my plea to the government is this: drop the named person, but more than that, I ask them to stop blaming and suspecting parents and start working with them. Thank you.